This is a sort of Estonia moment for Canadian digital services if we play it correctly.
Germany, Japan, the United States, Canada, the UK are wealthy enough to paper over many of their problems when it comes to government inefficiency.
What role did this existential threat from Russia play?
Do you really think that the intelligence services of your country could not get whatever information on you that they really wanted?
Welcome to the Functional Government Podcast. Today we're joined by Joel Burke, former head of business development for Estonia's pioneering e-residency program and author of Rebooting a Nation, The Incredible Rise of Estonia, E-Government, and the Startup Revolution. Joel has worked on 4 continents, advised the U.S. Congress on AI and technology policy, and has a unique insider's perspective on how Estonia transformed from Soviet bureaucracy to digital democracy. As Canada grapples with aging infrastructure, ballooning consultant fees, and a digital strategy that even consultants are begging us to fix, Joel offers a roadmap from a nation that faced similar challenges and emerged as a global leader. Hi, Joel. How you doing?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Soviet bureaucracy, for those people that don't know Estonia's history, can you give us like a very quick context of the sort of geopolitical and historical drivers that shaped today's Estonia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I won't go all the way back for hundreds and thousands of years, but I think that two most important periods to talk about are the first independence, which the country managed to get after World War I, 1918 to 1941, when the country was occupied again. But basically, the country has a long history of repeated occupations from regional powers, and then starting in 41, the Soviets occupy, then the Nazis occupy, then the Soviets occupy again, all the way up until the early 90s when Estonia gains its re-independence. And so the country has long dealt with a history of repression and occupation, even then has managed to forge a pretty unique culture. And so part of the reason why I worked on this book is because despite its history of occupation, despite all the hardship the country has gone through, in a single generation post-re-independence, they managed to become an e-government leader and a thriving tech and startup hub, which I thought was incredibly fascinating. But more than that, as a kind of model democracy, they've had online voting for, I think, almost 20 years now. So in a way, it's even more equitable and accessible than some places in the West.
So one of the things that keeps coming up when I talk to people about modernization is I want less government, not more. I want the government to stay out of my stuff. I don't trust the government. We hear a lot of Canadians say, I don't want single sign-on because the government shouldn't know who I am, or I don't want the CRA telling me, CRA is our version of the tax authority, telling me, how much I earned. I don't want them looking at my taxes. These are symptoms of a diminishing trust in the public sector and in government. I remember I was on stage last year and I asked Estonia's digital minister how they got a government with so much trust, and what she said really surprised me. She said, we're a low trust country. And that seems very contradictory to popular belief. Everyone hears about Estonia having wonderful government services and e-residency, all these other things. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. So a couple points that I'd like to make. The first one being, I definitely agree with this idea of Estonia being a relatively low trust society. As you can imagine, after so many decades of occupation, but I guess it depends who you're saying trust in who. And if you're saying trust in government, as in big government, I definitely think it's a low trust society. But if you're saying trust in kind of my neighbors and other Estonians, I think it's a higher trust society. I think part of what the Estonian government has had to do to grapple with this is, one, be very intentional about trying to maintain and build up the trust that the public has in government services. And in part, the way they do that is by delivering really effective government services. So you mentioned the CRA, and I mean, our equivalent is the IRS, right? And so in Estonia, they have an e-tax solution that 90% of individual filers use to submit their taxes. And the way it works is that basically when it's tax time, I get a notification. I slide in my digital identity card. I open up the e-tax portal, and it has a pre-filled thing that basically details everything that I've earned, because the government does know this information. I mean, governments exist to collect taxes. Sorry, this isn't going to change, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective. And so it kind of has a pre-filled solution. So I just scroll down, make sure everything in it is correct, and then click accept. And then I either get a refund or maybe I have to pay some taxes. And so when I filed my taxes as an American living there who had a pretty complicated tax return, given, I wasn't local, it still took me under 5 minutes to actually do my entire taxes. So compare that to the United States, where the government has this information anyways. They just, they might not have it in a well-constructed file format. It might be in a box on a desk in, some IRS cafeteria somewhere because of understaffing and, myriad other issues. But they do have this information or can get it. Instead of just telling me what I owe, I have to kind of guess, but also use third-party software that I have to pay for in order to give the government more of my money. And I also will probably have to use either, for me, most of a weekend to do my taxes, but for others who are more or less complex, maybe a little less time. But you're basically creating a time tax on people to the tune of, thousands, millions of hours of people time per year, as well as propping up an industry that I'm not sure needs to exist in its full way. And now the Intuit lobbyists are going to come after us, so I apologize. But
so if I understand correctly, because we don't trust government in North America, the government is disincentivized from actually admitting that it has all this data on us that it has anyway. So it spends less time showing us what it already knows. And the price we pay for that lack of transparency is we have to tell it things it already knows to continue this kind of charade that we're telling it what we earned when in fact it already knows it. That seems like just, what do they call it in wrestling? Kayfabe? Everybody knows they're playing a game, but they play the game anyway. I mean, is it really that silly that we don't want to know they know, so we pretend they don't by telling them? And if we tell them something that disagrees with what they already know, then they come after us.
Exactly. I mean, let's take an example. Do you really think that the intelligence services of your respective country could not get whatever information on you that they really wanted? I mean, in a legal manner, sure, but I mean, almost any information, they could either buy it from the private sector because the private sector has a huge amount of this information available for purchase through data brokers, or they could aggregate it from a bunch of different agencies. So really, all that's stopping them is that it might be like slightly more inconvenient. It might be on paper files, and in this way, this is something that I kind of nitpick with some privacy advocates, is that the way Estonia has architected this system is they basically have this e-government portal where you can go in and you see kind of your profile and all the different actions and activities that have happened, but you also see every time someone who has accessed or requested to access your data. And what this means is that there is some level of accountability that you can demand. And it's actually, I mean, it's in the law that you can actually demand to ask why someone has looked at your data if you don't understand why. So the Estonian government has basically architected both a technological solution and a legal solution that is somewhat more privacy preserving compared to the alternative that we have. Well, I shouldn't speak for Canada, as I'm less familiar with the system.
I want to ask you something there. It doesn't sound like it's more privacy preserving. It sounds like it acknowledges the lack of privacy that is the reality in the digital world and gives you a way of knowing what other people know about you and how they're behaving, as opposed to this charade we have where we pretend we have privacy in much of North America, at least, but we don't actually have that privacy.
Yeah, well, I guess here's where I think of it as privacy preserving. But in general, I agree with you, is that right now I have no idea what information the government has, who has it, who has looked at it. It could be on paper files somewhere. It could be in someone's desktop. They could have downloaded it. I have no idea. I guess I could submit FOIA requests to every government agency, but that would be expensive, time consuming.
FOIA means Freedom of Information Request, right?
Yeah. And it quite often takes a lawyer to actually process them. However, with the Estonian system, because it's so easy and because it's kind of a built-in mechanism to demand accountability, I would say that it deters, or in a theoretical instance where someone would access your files for a reason why they aren't supposed to have access, could deter someone from looking. So that's what I was thinking when I'm thinking privacy preserving.
Sure. But let's go back to the history lesson. 1991, Estonia emerges from Soviet occupation, and it basically has a blank slate. How did this forced restart, when we kind of knew what technology was going to become an advantage? And what role did this looming existential threat from Russia play to driving that innovation?
When you have a neighbor that has occupied you repeatedly and the sovereignty of your country is perennially at risk, you are very motivated as a government, as a populace, to do anything you can to make sure that doesn't happen again. So if you think about how Estonia has approached innovation, e-government, everything it invests in, there's kind of the one level where there's the program itself, but then there's also how does this help us deter Russia? And so even with e-residency, which was the program I worked for, and I always compared it to building the Delaware for Europe because, in essence, it allows folks to build a location independent business using their e-residency card that they can manage from anywhere in the world. While the program is profitable and it helps drive business growth in Estonia, a big reason for it is that it has the added benefit of creating friends around the world. So in the case of, Russia threatening it, that, maybe if you're an e-resident or you own a business in Estonia, you will stand up to your government and say like, hey, these guys are worth protecting. So everything kind of has this secondary benefit as you're thinking about it, or, secondary intention as you're thinking about it from the government side. But rolling back the clock a little bit to the early 90s, I also think there's a big component of economic necessity that was here. And so something I think in the West is because you often see, Germany, Japan, the United States, Canada, the UK are wealthy enough to paper over many of their problems when it comes to government inefficiency. Estonia did not have that luxury, especially in the early days. When you have a country that is significantly larger than Denmark, but with 1.3 million people spread out across this landmass, you can imagine it is quite difficult and expensive to provide government services to all of them. And this is something that the banking sector also found. Quite difficult to have a banking branch in a village of 20 people and run it profitably, right? And so providing government services to make government more efficient and effective is a great way to kind of get around that fiscal constraint. In a way, necessity is the mother of all invention, but for Estonia, this has been doubly true.
I think most people don't understand the geographic and structural factors. And when they do, they say, oh, well, Estonia could fix it because it's a small country. But the parallels I see between what you just discussed, having a large neighbor that you can't really trust, not having the budget to paper over all manner of sins, sound very relevant to Canada today. There's also a significant lack of trust in government. We saw the trucker rallies, protests around COVID mandates, a fairly vocal minority making a lot of noise, even though most Canadians, according to every single poll, seem to be very, I would say, centrist, but that's just math. Most people seem to have fairly trusting, on the surface, understanding of things. It seems like too much trust in government, not enough money to paper things over. We've had some catastrophic tech deployments and cost overruns. And we now have some saber rattling between Canada and the US and tariffs and so on. It seems like this is a sort of Estonia moment for Canadian digital services if we play it correctly. And I think the piece that's missing from what Canadians understand can exist in government is this idea of radical transparency. It's not just when you want to see who's looked at your stuff. When the minister was on stage last year at Forward 50, she told me her constituents could go and see the cost of her hotel last night if they wanted to. So it's not just I can see what the government knows. It's also I can see how the government's spending money at a granular level. Can you talk a little bit about that side of the coin?
Yeah, absolutely. Estonia is definitely a place where transparency is the norm. So the minister gave this example. The one that I like to give and that I always found very interesting is that if you go to the business register in Estonia and look up a business, you can see, I forget the exact level of granularity, but the number of employees, making sure that it has actually paid its taxes, and I think rough turnover amount. And so that's a level of information you don't get from like an LLC in incorporated in Delaware or Texas or Nevada, right? I mean, there's an element of intentional obfuscation in how the United States does business registration, but on one hand, I could see entrepreneurs and businesses being like, "Oh, I don't want my competitors to be able to access all this data." But you can imagine from if you're in more of a low trust society, and there's especially when we're thinking about government services, for instance, and there's at least in the United States, we have this revolving door, either issue or perceived issue of people kind of coming back and forth and profiting off their former work, or even profiting when they're in government. This level of transparency definitely helps build trust around the society, because while the average person may not be going and checking the business register all the time, you can be sure that with a free and independent media, they're going to be constantly going out, because that is a story. If the former prime minister now has an LLC that got a bunch of government contracts a couple of years after they left office, like that's a big story in Estonia, and hopefully that would be in Canada and the United States as well. And so I definitely think that because of the lack of initial trust, thanks to mostly the Soviet occupation, there were more mechanisms built into the Estonian system that were built to engender trust.
So let's assume that someone with the ability to change things is listening, and Canada seizes on this sort of unique moment where we have decreasing trust in government, the technology to make things transparent, a willingness to tackle problems that we've maybe papered over in the past because of economic pressures, and some saber rattling to the south. How did the Estonian sort of technology rollout, the order of operations work? Because you mentioned the digital ID card. I read somewhere that when they first came out, citizens said they were only good for scraping ice off windshields. Where was it when, I mean, obviously digital ID, which is something Canada struggled with, is the cornerstone of making any technology interactive. You need to know who someone is before they can do something with the platform. So Estonia had like a sequence of these things: digital ID cards, then they got into digital banking, then e-cabinet and e-tax in around 2000. What was it about the order of operations where they allowed themselves to build to where they are today?
I actually think this is something that a country following in Estonia's footsteps or modernizing today can and should do better. Surely there was intent around this. And I'd say part of the reason why e-tax came so early is you can imagine if you are a small state, relatively impoverished, and there has not been a bunch of infrastructure, one of your biggest priorities is, as a government, is the ability to collect taxes so you can actually fund government offer. I mean, that's why government exists, right? So I think there was a little less intentionality necessarily on exactly, building some services that would be great for people and build trust, but also it was what was necessary to begin with, as well as, frankly, there's a level of individual autonomy here, right? So there were just certain people in certain agencies at certain times who were like, well, I'm an engineer, I'm just going to build this thing, right? And that was allowed, right? And so for Canada or for other countries that are thinking about this, indeed, I think Estonia looks at basically the X road, which is the kind of digital backbone, and the digital identity, which is how you authenticate yourself, as the two foundational things. So I would say I've always thought about this I'm an American, worked in Congress. I think about this more from an American perspective. I would consider this order of operations where instead of going out and trying to do the really, really hard things first, because there has been such a lack of successes on the kind of digital government side and the ability for government to even procure the correct software, to consider trying to get a couple of quick wins first before going after the really hard things like building a digital identity solution that's going to roll out to the entire country. I'll use the U.S. example of something that unfortunately was deprecated, is basically the free to file program. This program, for those who aren't aware, is basically something that they had been building in the IRS to enable folks from various different states. They were rolling out increasingly across more states. Well, to file freely using an online tax filing system. It was government provided. It was, by all accounts, running quite well in the kind of MVP stage and initial rollouts. Unfortunately, it was deprecated for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me. But doing something like this and demonstrating that government can build software that works and solves a real problem for people before you kind of go after building something incredibly big seems like it makes a lot of sense, just based on where the level of trust and historical tendencies are at. Now, on digital ID, one thing I would say is that Estonia had a unique moment where they were able to kind of push this through, right? It wasn't popular to make digital identity mandatory at the beginning. So for the United States, for Canada, it might make more sense to try and find a public-private partnership that can kind of be stitched together. And you see this forming organically in the U.S. at least, where Apple and Google, via their operating systems, are working with states to host digital driver's licenses, right? So I do wonder if for other countries like the United States, where if you're talking about the early 90s, smartphones were not a thing when Estonia was architecting these systems. So for us, it might look a little bit different.
Yeah, we definitely in Canada log in using our banking credentials, which is something that was installed fairly quickly thanks to the crisis of COVID and wanting to do the COVID payouts to citizens. There was something called CERB, the COVID benefits that went out, and you logged in through your bank, and that became sort of a form of authentication for banks. So point taken on the public-private marriage there. I think there are opportunities to do that for some of these things. The real challenge for Canada, I think, is getting all of the different departments to comply with that one kind of login. Let's move forward a little bit. You've described the initial political battles in your work and the bureaucratic resistance. What specific tactics worked to get buy-in from skeptical ministers and civil servants? And how did Estonia handle the kind of privacy concerns that paralyze many Western democracies?
I think this took leadership from the top. I think it's really important that the president and prime minister of Estonia, quite often, as well as influential political figures outside the government or around it, were fully on board with digitalizing the country and were prepared to fight and burn political capital on it. So Prime Minister Mart Laar had this tech policy advisor, Linar Vik, who helped to basically push through the architecting of many of these early systems and things like making the digital identity mandatory. You can imagine for a country that was just under Soviet occupation, having mandatory identity of any form was not exactly the most popular thing, but it was hugely consequential for making sure that there was enough of a user base that then the private sector and other folks would feel like it made sense to actually invest and build capabilities that kind of were integrated into this platform. And frankly, it was a willingness from various important leaders over the time. I would shout out, Prime Minister Laar, Linar Vik, former President Ilves, Simsika Tavikotka, the former CIOs of the country, to burn political capital and force things through. And I wish there was a more elegant way. I'm sure there were many incentive programs. I mean, there were, like with the Tiger Leap campaign, there were incentive programs, there were, public relations campaigns, there were all these things. But at the end of the day, I think it took sustained investment and focus from the highest levels of the political establishment over a series of many years and terms to get these things done.
So a lot of people who don't want the government up in their business like the fact that they get to say what they earned because it gives them a chance to sort of live in the gray area of paying full taxes or whatever. Estonia has a program called Accelerate Estonia, where they quite literally ask you what law you would like to see done away with, right? And their slogan is making the illegal legal. It seems like this is an interesting counterpoint where the government is acknowledging that bureaucracy can grow and become its own purpose, and that the only way to keep the garden growing, calling back to one of Jen Paulka's talks, is to do a little pruning of the weeds. It doesn't seem like that's something that happens in the West much. And maybe it was the fact that Estonia got to press a big reset button in 91, but what's the other side of this coin? We're going to build these digital services. How do we also go and delete the useless, wasteful, old, please send me a copy of your check by fax machine to a population that has neither checkbooks nor fax machines? How do we prune that stuff?
Well, this might shock your listeners, but government isn't infallible. They actually make mistakes, even in Estonia. And so over 30 years, like kludge builds up in systems, even in relatively well-run systems, starting from a blank slate. I mean, this is something that Estonia is increasingly dealing with in general, but on the legal side, on the policy side, but also on the technical side.
Let's dig into this a bit because nobody ever talks about the downside. We literally get people in the survey forms from Forward 50 saying, please stop talking about Estonia. So I think they would love to hear that sometimes. Give me some examples of kludge building up in the system.
Look, so it's not exactly kludge, but I'd give you the example from one I know very well, which is the e-residency program. So with e-residency, it was a pretty novel idea. This idea of, so Estonia had its e-government digital infrastructure, and the concept was, well, from a technology standpoint, it can scale dramatically more than the 1.3 million people it serves, right? It's not that hard to build up the compute infrastructure to do that. So what happens if we do this? And so this was basically pitched at kind of something of an idea hackathon by Simsika and Tavikotka, initially, as well as a few other folks, but the idea had been floating around for a while. But what it meant was that the way the law was written, I think, was basically that these e-government cards, digital ID was for residents, it was for physical persons in Estonia, it was for Estonian citizens abroad. Like, it wasn't meant for third country nationals. So it actually necessitated a legal change in order for the program to get developed. So what happened was that after this kind of ideathon, and it picked up steam, they convinced the parliament to proactively change the legislation so that the program could actually exist, right? So I would just use that as an example of, like, when they wrote the initial laws for, even for EID some years prior, they had no idea of the concept of, like, maybe third country nationals would want to use our digital infrastructure. Like, that sounds crazy on its face. Like, why would they want to do that? So they hadn't written the law in a way, but they proactively went through and changed it. And I think this is really important, is that, kind of going back and having worked in Congress, I can tell you a big part of the reason is why this doesn't happen is it's not that sexy to modify laws versus build a new program wholesale, building the CHIPS Act and bringing factories and fabs to America. Like, that's cool. That's something you can sell, right? Modifying an existing law to make it slightly easier for people to issue digital identity, like it's very cool in the Estonian context, but like, it's a little less cool. So it gets less attention in a world where there's less airtime and not enough time to accomplish all the things you need to at a government level. You can understand that these things kind of get pushed the wayside. However, I will shout out my hometown, San Francisco, which has been working with, I believe, a group from Stanford. Jen Polka just had a poster, a LinkedIn post or whatever about this, but they're using AI to basically understand the depths of, well, all the kludge that is built up over time for the city, and then use that to eliminate redundancy. So I do think there is maybe a role for technology here in some cases, but again, I think much of this is a matter of political will and saying, like, I am going to be the person who spends the time to get rid of this.
We've had some pretty interesting scandals in Canada, but one of the biggest ones is the work of consultants charging to find people to do technical work as sort of pass-through corporations. There have been a few companies like GC Strategies that have been named and discussed a considerable amount on Capitol Hill here, and we have had a significant amount of concern about how a few people are getting these contracts. Trying to stay nonpartisan here, but it ain't a good look. How did Estonia avoid creating this sort of pass-through model of consulting where the consulting companies take a significant commission, pass it on to somebody who's not really committed to delivering the whole thing, they're just a contractor, and then sort of hollow out the public service? I mean, Estonia was always a pretty technical country, so how did they avoid that hollowing out process?
Yeah. Well, before I get into that, I just want to mention in the United States, we definitely have, I don't know if we have literally the same problem, but the hollowing out of public sector capacity to deliver anything, it seems like, whether it's infrastructure or digital infrastructure, seems like doesn't seem like it is a serious problem that we're grappling with. And I am a big fan of trying to bring in-house more technical capability and try and burnish government skill sets in this. So I think the approach was just overall different. Estonia looked at it as not just a way to build its government services. It looked at the public-private partnerships as, well, partnerships, and as a way to build an export industry. So what the government did, and this was quite intentional, is they basically would go out and work with local companies and local tech consultancies. So this is like Nortal, Digital Nation, Cybernetica, these folks, and use them to help build up different aspects of the e-government system. And then from that, Estonia basically functioned as a proof of concept customer, where they would then, these companies would then turn around and go to the rest of the world and say, hey, we helped build part of the world's most advanced digital society. We can do the same for you, right? And so in a way, you can think of it as also building up an export market. That was quite intentional. The other thing that I think Estonia did really well is while indeed it is more technical, they have like a great deal of technical capacity in-house. But as I said, they intentionally outsourced much of the development. But what they didn't outsource is a lot of the internal procurement capability for actually writing the right requirements and finding the right projects. And I think this is something that's super underrated. And again, one of those things that's like not very cool. Like, we need more people to write better technical requirements for procurement documents. It doesn't sound like the coolest job in the world compared to, we have USDS and, 18F and, going out and, building and architecting new things. But it's really, really important that you write these procurement documents in a way that you don't end up with, I think Jen Polka talks about concrete boats, where you have this beautiful document and then the thing that gets delivered will never sail because it makes no sense. So I think this is something that Estonia has done really well. So this is something that I'm also pushing a little bit for in U.S. government agencies as they're thinking about modernizing and improving their technical capabilities. It's not just bringing in more engineers writ large, but also bringing in more technical capacity to the procurement departments.
So Canada spent like $20 billion on IT services in the last 8 years, some roughly a staggering amount, with 40% of that going to just 13 companies. Estonia built their entire system for a fraction of that cost. Is what you're talking about one of the big differences. What else explains that huge gap?
One of the venture investors, I should say, who also did a significant amount of work in the government, mostly pro bono, once described to me the mentality in Estonia as irrational patriotism. And this was more in the context of why the Estonian tech community supports other Estonian tech founders so religiously and really helps them. And this is part of the reason that explains their kind of startup side success. But I also do think this has had pretty major impacts for government software procurement, where yes, these companies were running a business. Yes, they were trying to, they were trying to make money in payroll, but it was also not just maximum profit extraction. They were trying to build something for their country. And I think this is a really important and underrated aspect. So I don't know how you replicate that in the rest of the world exactly. I think Estonia benefited somewhat, and I'm usually skeptical of they're small, so they're different. But in this case, I think because it was a small enough market, you didn't have the massive contractors kind of trying to come in and profit from the country because it was just too small for them to bother, at least initially. However, for actually providing useful advice, I would definitely think about contracting and doing so in a way that it's not just pass-throughs, it's you work with one entity who's actually on the hook for delivering, and they actually need to have that capacity, and working with companies that have a proven track record. I think there's something that happens in the US where even companies that fail quite dramatically at delivering digital products can win again and again because they know how to fill out the procurement forms and know how to, shake the right hands and be in the right places at the right times. But this seems quite bad for society instead of just focusing on who can actually deliver the solution on time and on budget.
That's an interesting way to look at it, because we think of the tech industry as high risk, high return. 1,000 companies, one becomes the unicorn. If you're building e-tech, you have this weird world where you want low risk, fairly predictable returns, and you're not going to get rich on it. You're not going to have a lot of stock options and stuff like that. Your payoff is a better society. Those two themes seem very antithetical: the culture and the expectation, the norms of tech, which allow it to grow at an outsized rate. Is antithetical to delivering digital government, and we don't talk about that much.
And it's funny because in the book, I describe the e-government services industry in Estonia as much more akin to the defense industry than the tech industry. I mean, whereas both the tech industry and the e-government are shipping software, like you said, the returns and the kind of risk profile that you want is somewhere a little bit closer to defense. And the analogy isn't perfect, but when I think about it, and also how Estonia has leveraged e-government exports as a way of building binding ties with foreign countries, I mean, across the Middle East, across Africa, you can imagine if you go and you help build and architect an e-government system that underpins a nation's, basically government operations, that's a long-term partnership that you're going to have, right? And so I think in the same way, selling F-35s, this is Estonia's equivalent.
And I think if you look at what Ukraine did with DIA, where they were using the app to identify saboteurs and report spies and stuff, it does become a tool for national security. I'm listening to Nicole Perlos's To Catch a Thief, and she talks about how the Chinese don't really distinguish between economic security and defense spending. And it seems like, government infrastructure, economic infrastructure, defense infrastructure, those things are all commingled these days in ways that they weren't maybe 20 years ago, where we would sort of spy on our adversaries, but we wouldn't really steal their trade secrets. That stuff's getting all blurry now in a digital world. Let's switch in the time that we have left to talking about Canada, because it really does seem to me that we're missing some of these things, right? We had this Phoenix payroll disaster, which was basically, let's write an RFP that nobody can possibly deliver and get it custom built. There's an article in The Walrus that came out recently that said it's sort of like defining a car, and then the last line says, and must fit exactly in this parking spot in the government building, as opposed to maybe just, buy some cars instead of making them from scratch. How did Estonia resist the urge to build everything bespoke, or did it?
Well, I think, again, necessity being the mother of all invention here, I think especially in the early days, budgets were just extremely tight. So there was, I mean, when people built bespoke, it was often, I think, not in the extravagant way that we're talking about for these things. It was more, what is this open source system that we can build on top of that will, we change just enough to accomplish our needs with a couple of guys in a garage, instead of having to, procure something from Microsoft or Oracle for $20 bajillion, right?
Given that desperation, were people willing to change what they wanted based on what the tool got rather than the other way around?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also there was a more willingness to embrace DIY efforts and a bigger embrace of open source. This is something that, frankly, I push on a little bit more in the U.S. I think there's a lot of situations where the government can and should be building systems itself, and if the Air Force is procuring something that can also be leveraged by the Department of Energy, then they should be open sourcing it, or at least internally open sourcing it and sharing that code base and documentation. So I definitely think there is a willingness to build what mattered and what was going to be most impactful at the time, and kind of put other requirements to the wayside. Now, over time, this has crept in, to be honest with you. There's more of a, we're going to digitize everything, kind of like a steamroller of digitization, in part because it's become part of Estonia's national brand to like be the digital nation. But there was definitely like robust prioritizing in the early days.
So for Canadian citizens who are watching their services deteriorate, going from number 3 to number 47, I'm getting tired of saying that, in the UN digital ranking, what specific demands should they be making of their government?
It's tough for citizens. I mean, this is the part where I blame the politicians and not the citizens. So let me back up here a little bit. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is not just because I thought Estonia was neat and because I really admired the country, but because after coming back to the U.S. and working in Congress, I kind of had an oh shit moment, and I was just stunned at how far behind in terms of just pure capacity we were compared to Estonia. And part of
North
the reason
Americans don't seem to realize, I mean, this is one of the fundamental ideas of this podcast, is that we're gaslighting ourselves. We don't understand just how far ahead the rest of the world is on this stuff. And it's this weird downward spiral. It's like a trap where, because we don't understand it, we're just frustrated and mad at government, which means we don't fund government, which means we don't get it better, so we don't understand it. It seems like a trap.
Exactly. Yeah, you get into this doom loop or death spiral or whatever the proper term is, and then and people leverage this. Well, you don't trust government, so government doesn't deliver, so we're not going to fund government, and then it really isn't going to deliver, and then So what can people actually demand and tangibly do? I definitely think that in general, being supportive of government innovation and saying that sometimes people make mistakes, but in supporting this, but also being really, really rough on, I don't want to say corruption. I mean, yes, rough on corruption, but also rough on kind of these deals that don't actually benefit anyone. I think, government outsourcing is totally fine. Government working with private sector partners to deliver capabilities is totally fine. I'm not against that per se, as long as it's effective and actually delivers value for people. So what I would say is hold a torch up to when these things go wrong and demand accountability, but not in the sense of saying, and no more software ever again, but saying like, hey, no, you should actually build these things and do it correctly. Like, you promised me government services that worked. Now build government services that work.
So Estonia's transformation has survived multiple changes in government. What you're talking about, in the West at least, seems to be a politician comes in and blames what happened on the previous administration for political gain, and then restarts or abandons whatever digital initiatives there were. After multiple changes in Estonia's government, how did it maintain continuity for this stuff?
This is another one of those things where I think national security has played a role. I would, liken it a little bit to the U.S. during the Cold War period. Our foreign policy was broadly similar between parties, and so this is not necessarily replicable. But I do think that there needs to be some sort of elite consensus where folks come together at the highest levels and say, "Hey, this is good for the country. We are going to do this." And does it need to be exactly the same? No. I mean, maybe instead of only investing in, the tax office first, there's more investment in e-government services for police forces. I don't know. In the U.S., it's usually like, supporting police and military is kind of one side, and supporting, social services is kind of the other side. So I think that's fine that, policy priorities shift in kind of, a little bit back and forth there. That's natural in any democracy. And should happen. But I think like the overall vision of like, we are going to digitize, we are going to make government more efficient, more effective, and doing so in broadly the same way is really important for folks to come to. And so one thing I do worry about, especially in the U.S. current context, is that some of this stuff gets a bit politicized. I'm not going to go too much into the details there, but I think everyone everyone knows. We don't have to talk about this on this podcast because it's being talked about on every other podcast. Exactly. So I do worry about this, but I think making clear that like it is a apolitical thing to want government broadly to work better, no matter your goals. Because if you're a political party in power, like, you want to be able to affect the change that you were brought into office to do, and to do so, you need government to work.
Okay, last question. If you were advising Prime Minister Mark Carney today, what would your 3 immediate actions be? Like, you have somewhat strong political support. You don't have majority government, but you have some political support, and you need to make the country realize that modernizing digital services has to happen, that the cost overruns and outsourcing and hollowing out has to end, that some of the things that a vocal minority might not like nevertheless need to happen for us to have good functional government. What do you say? What are the 3 things you should do?
So I've been noodling on this because it's a question I much more often get for the U.S. context, and so I apologize as I'm less familiar with the Canadian context. But what I would say is, as we talked about a little bit before, is finding some initial project that can kind of be the figurehead, to get a quick win and say, like, hey, this is what we can do and this is what we can deliver for the people. So in the U.S. I talked about the free to file stuff, but in Canada I assume there's some other find a low hanging fruit project that's very visible that can concretely be delivered on, and then do the thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we talked a lot about the hollowing out of the civil service and the increasing lack of capacity. And so apologies again, I'm just a little less familiar with the Canadian context, but the advice I would give is, think about more of the Singapore-esque model. So they do a couple things really well. There's one thing in particular that I would mention for Singapore, is that they target salaries in a way that is really effective to the private sector. So I generally think this is a bit of a cop-out for many people. They say, we can't recruit the best talent because we can't pay private sector salaries. And, on the margins, that's true. But I think there's a lot of other reasons why people join government, like, the mission, love of country, et cetera. But I do think there has to be some baseline of paying the right amount of salary. So once you have that done, I also think that making it dramatically easier to hire and fire people in the civil service is really, really important. And so it might sound strange that I'm advocating to make it easier to fire people, but I do think that, if you're going to have a government that has trust in folks and you're going to try and do more experiments, bring in more people, bring in more technologists who are highly paid, you want to be in a situation where you can say, hey, we're going to bring a bunch of people in, but if there's bad performers, we're going to be able to cut them. But at the same time, I also think that when it comes to government, there are often, and again, U.S. context, 6, 12 plus wait times between you actually putting a job description up and in getting the person to have their butt at a desk. And that is just impossible. I mean, it's one thing to say to a software engineer, hey, I know you're making $500,000 in Silicon Valley, but you should come to D.C. and make, $175,000 and do it for the love of the country. And you're going to have a cool mission. But by the way, we actually can't tell you when you're going to start, and it's going to be anywhere from 12 to 18 months. And when we do call you, you're going to have to move in 2 weeks, right? That's a crazy ask, right? And so I do think, a level of just introducing more, and I guess this is really where I was trying to get at from the Singapore context, a more private sector-esque hiring and firing and compensation norms into the civil service is really important.
Awesome. If he ever asks, we'll be happy to forward you the introduction, but it does seem like Canadians should be somewhat hopeful. Like, this has been a problem we've solved before. As my Forward 50 co-chair Hillary Hartley said, you never waste a good crisis, right? And we have a number of crises, from the advent of AI to geopolitics that are happening right now, to Canada's budget and some of the problems we've had delivering technology, both in the past and some of the benefits modernization work that we're doing. It does seem like Canada needs a reset. And short of, overturning the government to an entirely new thing and building it from scratch, we're going to have to engineer that reset ourselves. Joel, how can people find out more about this Estonian miracle? I know you've sort of been embedded as someone who actually lived there and experienced it, and so you have a good view of both North American and Estonian norms. What's the best way for people to learn more about this?
Well, the first shameless plug is to buy my book, which is now available, Rebooting a Nation, available where all good books are sold. I think there's also there's a couple great podcasts, and Estonia, has a podcast that they run. But I would also highly advise people go out and visit Estonia. The Estonia Briefing Center is a place that you can go. They'll give you a little bit of a briefing and a history of the country. Like, go out and see it. Go see it in the wild, and get your government to pay for it, ideally.
Only go in the summer, right? I hear you.
Right. Yes. Yeah. May is the best time. There's lots of lovely conferences. It's great.
Amazing. Joel, thank you so much. Really love the fact that you're pulling back the veil here. I think this is a new take that explains some of what actually happened. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.